Tony, he might have been a little bit delayed, but we'll kick off with us. So very, very warm welcome to everybody to this webinar, which is titled The IHRA Definition of Anti-Semitism Protects Israel, Not Jews, Building the Resistance to a Definition which is now being used to justify genocide. I'm Kristina Hultgren. I am Professor of Sociolinguistics at the Open University and UK Research and Innovation Future Leaders Fellow, and I'm honoured to have been asked by the Jewish Network Palestine to chair this important webinar together with Tony Greenstein. We have an outstanding lineup of speakers tonight, each of whom is going to speak for about 10 minutes, and we're then going to open up the floor to questions. A little bit of housekeeping first. The webinar will be recorded and made available afterwards. So please, everybody could say just, well, your cameras and mics are actually already switched off. We've done that for you. But if you want to ask a question later on, then please do so in the Q&A chat. Okay, just a little bit of intro from me. So what is the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism? Why is it problematic, and how can we build resistance against it? Well, in a nutshell, the IHRA definition conflates criticism of Israel or anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. This conflation is a deliberate strategy by the Israel lobby to confuse people, make them self-censor or hold back from speaking out against Israel's well-evidenced violations of international law and crimes against humanity. No one wants to be accused of being anti-Semitic, so it's safer to stay silent. The IHRA definition can and has been used to suppress, intimidate, and penalize those who are still brave enough to speak out against Israel's ongoing settler-colonialism, ethnic cleansing, and genocide of the Palestinian people. I'd strongly encourage everyone to read through the IHRA definition carefully for themselves and make up their own minds as to the nature and extent of its problems. And I would also suggest reading the IHRA definition alongside another definition, such as the Jerusalem Declaration of Anti-Semitism, or JDA, because this makes it very clear why the latter is preferable to the former. So I'll post a link to them both here in the chat for you to read later on. Actually, it's not showing up as a link here, so you'll have to Google that yourselves. Okay, but basically where the IHRA definition is broad and vague, the JDA is much more precise. And the most useful thing for me about the JDA is perhaps that it distinguishes clearly between what is on the face of it anti-Semitic and what is on the face of it unlikely to be anti-Semitic. So this means that it manages to both safeguard Jewish individuals against hate speech, while also protecting that crucial space for free speech and evidence-based criticism of Israel. I would also have pasted a link in the chat to a report, but I'm not going to do it now because it doesn't show up as a link. But please do Google this report as well. It's a report that has been written by the European Legal Support Centre and the British Society for Middle Eastern Studies on some of the adverse effects of the IHRA definition on freedom of speech and academic freedom in the UK higher education. And there's also ample academic literature on the definition. A little bit of history, and I won't take too long. I'm sure you're dying to get to hear the speakers. But a little bit of history. So the IHRA definition came about 2 decades ago when the AJC, the American Jewish Committee, produced a brief definition of anti-Semitism and listed some examples, which equated anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism. In 2016, the brief definition was adopted by the intergovernmental body, the IHRA. However, the IHRA website then illegitimately published the entire document, so not just the brief preamble, but also the examples, which explicitly conflate anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism, implying that the IHRA had adopted those too. Since then, Western governments have persistently, some might say aggressively, promoted and deployed the IHRA definition. There's ample example of that. For instance, the European Commission has sought to roll it out across all European nation states since 2021. The webinar here is going to focus on how we can resist the IHRA definition across universities and more generally across other institutions in society. There is currently little collective knowledge about resistance, so the aim of the webinar is to build up that collective knowledge and offer a basis for lesson drawing for future strategy. Our speakers will speak to a range of ways in which the IHRA definition has been resisted, but just to give you a couple of examples to start you off with. In 2018, the IHRA definition was publicly opposed by more than 40 Jewish groups worldwide. And notwithstanding the fact that the European Commission has sought since 2021 to promote the definition, similar attempts were resisted 2 decades earlier by a European network of Jewish pro-Palestine groups. In 2006, their joint intervention actually helped dissuade the European Commission from adopting the IHRA definition. Long before its adoption by the IHRA in 2016, the definition was denounced by the UK's academic trade unions, the Association of University Teachers, and the National Association of Teachers in Further and Higher Education. Later, it was denounced again by their merger, the University and College Union, UCU, and likewise by many UCU branches. At University College London, UCL, it was rejected by the academic board, and there was similar resistance at Warwick University and the Open University. And I do believe that some of our speakers will speak more about this. Likewise, when university administrators have deployed the IHRA definition in disciplinary procedures or for imposing constraints on Palestine events, they have faced pushback by academic staff and students. So this webinar then will take up the following questions. What has been the resistance to the IHRA definition? In what venues and with what results? How can resistance be better publicized and strengthened? And with those questions in mind, and without any further ado, it's a very great pleasure to hand over to our first speaker, who is a birthday boy. So happy birthday to Professor David Johnson. I'll just share your slides with speakers as well.
Thanks, Kristina.
See here.
I could start talking while they go up if you like.
There we go. Can you see the slide?
That's the first one. Yeah, that's great. Okay, just to open by thanking the organizers for the invitation to talk to all of you today and to thank so many people for coming along on a Friday evening. I think I've been invited to talk because my university, the Open University, resisted the government demand to institutionalize the IHRA definition in ways that could be useful, could be instructive. I put that image up at the start, just a reminder. It's an image of Al-IHRA University in Gaza being blown up by IDF landmines on the 17th of January 2024, the last of the Gazan universities to be destroyed. And so I think useful to just have a reminder that what we do here, the intellectual, ideological struggles we're having are being paralleled by far more horrific destruction in Gaza that's ongoing. Just to go to the next slide, the first slide, they're just 3 slides and they're summaries. I've timed myself and will stick very closely to my 10 minutes. The first one is just a quick timeline of the IHRA definition. Kristina's helpfully summarized when it was drafted and adopted by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. The key moment in the UK was in 2018 when the government adopted the definition. And then from the point of view of UK universities, the major document was published on the 9th of October 2020 when Gavin Williamson, the Minister of Education, wrote to all UK universities urging them to adopt the IHRA definition. He wrote that, and these are his words, "It was frankly disturbing that most universities had not adopted the IHRA definition. He accused universities of dragging their feet, his words again, and he threatened regulatory action against those universities who rejected the definition, including, and these were the chilling words that he used, that he would suspend funding streams. And as a result of that threat, very rapidly the number of British universities adopting the definition increased very rapidly. And I've just given some dates as the numbers increased. In October 2020, there were only 29 universities who'd adopted it. A year later, in September 2021, there were 80 out of the 133 universities. And a year later, in July 2022, the Office for Students reported that 243 universities and FE colleges had adopted the IHRA definition. In a more critical, peevish sort of tone, the Jewish News reported a year later, in September 23, that there were still 43 universities that hadn't adopted it. But in the same month, the British Society for Middle Eastern Studies and the European Legal Support Centre published a very helpful report, which made two very important findings. The first was that 75% of UK universities had adopted the definition. That's over 200 HE institutions. But also, very importantly, they looked at the cases where the definition, people had brought charges of anti-Semitism against staff and students at UK universities. And they discovered that 38 of the 40 were deemed vexatious and rejected, and the two others were unresolved at the time of the report being written. I think that's, as I say, a very important part of the resistance to the definition. Googling the words IHRA definition and UK universities, it's very striking that there's a real peak in 2021, around that period, and that in the last 2 years it's had less attention. But certainly globally, it's very important that how ruthlessly and how energetically pro-Israel lobby groups are trying to enforce the definition, to the extent that Harvard University adopted it in February this year. And the Australian government has also issued very stern instructions to Australian universities to adopt the IHRA definition. So just, Kristina, on to the next slide, which will just talk you through how at the Open University we resisted the definition, or did our best to neutralize its effects. You'll remember the Williamson speech was in October 2020. The Open University Senate in January 21 had a discussion on whether to adopt the IHRA definition. They were very mindful. Any vice chancellor is terrified of obviously losing funding for his institution, so they were very mindful and very eager to not upset the government of the day. But they didn't want to push it through forthwith, so they agreed a period of consultation during which Senate members could educate themselves about the definition and contending definitions. And in the 2 months that followed, they set up an online consultation forum, which was meant to educate Senate members. This was a really important forum because a couple of very pro-Israel, sympathetic to the IHRA definition members of Senate posted frequently asked questions and answers, which were very, very strongly in favor of encouraging Senate members to vote for its exclusive adoption. Together with a couple of people, we drafted in the 2 or 3 weeks before the Senate meeting, we drafted another 10 pages of questions and answers setting out the problems with the IHRA definition. And our Senate members were very conscientious and read all that documents. And I do think that having those arguments set out and available for the Senate members made a fundamental difference. The motion that was brought to our Senate in April that year was brought by the Education Committee, an important subcommittee, and it was supported 100% by the Vice Chancellor's executive to adopt the IHRA definition in full and in isolation. We were faced with the choice whether to fight that and try and get it voted down. And on the balance of probabilities, with the degree of institutional support and taking a careful look at the Senate members, we decided that we would almost certainly lose. So what we decided in an attempt to neutralize its effect was to add an amendment to adopt the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism definition. And the words we used was to accompany, clarify, and reinforce the IHRA definition. Now, it was a very difficult thing to do that because those of us who were critical of the IHRA definition had to swallow the fact that it would go through, but we hoped that this strategy would neutralize it. And the arguments we made in favor of an amended motion were the following four main arguments. The first was that the exclusive adoption of the IHRA definition would threaten academic freedom, as staff and students would avoid subjects or texts for fear of being accused of anti-Semitism. The most obvious example is, something like post-colonial studies with its foundations in the work of Edward Said. It would be very easy for a vexatious pro-Zionist to take out of context a quote from Said and say this shouldn't be taught. It could quite literally, mean the end of teaching post-colonial studies at a university if it was followed through. The second argument, and this was important too, was that the university's existing anti-racist policies protected protection against all forms of racism, including anti-Semitism. The third argument was that the IHRA definition by Kenneth Stern was written to monitor anti-Semitism worldwide, not for universities, whereas the JD definition, written by a group of eminent scholars, the number of signatories is now over 370, was written specifically for universities. We also pointed out the fact that Kenneth Stern, the author of the IHRA definition, had disowned it, and also the many ways in which it was vague and unhelpful compared to the concision of the JD definition. And the fourth argument was the important one. The IHRA definition conflates criticism of the State of Israel and anti-Semitism, whereas the JD definition provides clear examples differentiating between them. Now, the important, it was there were over 100 Senate members. It was held online. It was a debate that went on for an hour. At the end of the debate, we prevailed. Both the adoption of the motion and the amendment were adopted by a large majority. And what Senate accepted was that the Open University's own statement on principles on academic freedom and the UK Equality Act will continue to take precedence in providing the legal framework. I think that's very important in addressing accusations of racism and anti-Semitism. But crucially, and for us, this was the victory, that the two definitions, the IHRA definition and the JD definition, would have equal status in providing guidance. And our view was that, faced with the choice of having exclusively the IHRA or nothing, pushing through both was the best way we could think of neutralizing its impact. The University Council, the university's highest body, approved Senate's recommendation. So that's the status quo at the Open University now. Now, Kristina, if you could turn just to the final slide, a quick couple of concluding points. The first point is one I actually haven't put on the slide, but I was thinking about this afternoon, is that it's really important to acknowledge that this idea of conflating anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism has a very long history. Abba Eban in 1973, the Israeli minister, wrote, and this is a quote, he said, "One of the chief tasks of any dialogue with the Gentile world is to prove that the distinction between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism is not a distinction at all. Anti-Zionism is merely the new anti-Semitism." And that, if you like, strategy, that mission statement by Eban, the IHRA definition is basically an update of that. The defenders of the State of Israel, promoters of now in okay, the recordings come back on. The 2025 is a very different Britain compared to 2021, and people have watched the horrors unfolding in Gaza, and I think a far larger number of my colleagues at the university and in Britain more broadly would be very critical of Israel and would have would be much more receptive to rejecting the IHRA definition out of hand. The second point to make is just it's important to register the specificities of different university institutional cultures. We were fortunate in having a robust Senate where debate still happens, and as people at Senate Council it felt as if we could still make a difference. I know many other universities in the UK and elsewhere do not. People at the university do not have that. They are much more authoritarian, much more hierarchical, that space does not exist. It's much harder to make these kinds of arguments and have an impact. So strategy has to be adapted accordingly. The third point is just one of thinking about the relationship between principle and strategy. As a point of principle, I personally abominate the IHRA definition and would like it to go away completely. But we live in a world where not everybody agrees. and people who need to be persuaded certainly don't agree. So we had to think of a way in the longer term of making basically a way of having structures and policies in place that would protect anybody who was the victim of a vexatious charge of anti-Semitism, and having the two definitions accompanied by the university's own academic freedom commitments and the UK Equalities Act felt like the best way we could secure their protection. The next point is just to look at the institutional application of those definitions. I've really made that point already, that you need to think, I think in very practical terms, how best can you help an academic or a student or a university worker who's being accused of anti-Semitism? What procedures, what documents, what policy documents can be in place for their caseworker, for their lawyer to draw upon in order to refute those charges? I do believe that the combination that we've ended up with will provide very substantial support and make it very difficult to pin that kind of charge on somebody who was simply making pro-Palestine statements. And finally, this is just a final point. When I like making arguments in my personal capacity, I prefer to refer to history and politics and economics. But I know, again, thinking about people who work at lots of universities, what do they think about? What are their reference points? What convinces them to change their mind? And I think the things that really are powerful are appeals to academic freedom, the prospect that the IHRA definition will inhibit academic freedom resonated powerfully. The idea that suddenly you wouldn't be able to teach Palestinian history or literature if the IHRA definition was given free and untrammeled rein. And the second thing is to also invoke the university's often hollow, but nonetheless, they're out there, those commitments to equality, diversion, and inclusion, and to frame any debates about Palestine in relation to them. Those would be my closing remarks. So thanks again, Kristina, and I hope I haven't gone over my time.
No, that's perfect. Thank you so much for that, David. Very comprehensive account of the debate at the OU. And I think the points that you made about the OU actually having had that debate was really helpful, unlike other universities, which might be a bit more authoritarian. And in that regard, it can even be added that in the council minutes, the Senate was in fact complemented by the breadth and depth of the debate that took place. So if you do actually have the debate, then many people, sensible people, will be able to see the problems with the IHRA definition. So thank you so much for that, David. We will let you go out and celebrate your birthday now. And we will hand over to our next speaker, who is Ilan Pappe. Over to you, Ilan.
Yeah. No. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. It's great to be with all these distinguished guests on the panel. I think I have about 10 minutes. Is this correct?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Okay. 10 minutes. Okay. The first point I would like to make, and maybe it's kind of continues where David has left his analysis, that this is beyond. I think the whole debate we have in the universities on the IHRA is beyond the question of the IHRA. This is something to do with the humiliation that we actually are experiencing as academic institutions. In some of the universities where the management tells people what is the definition of a Holocaust denial, some of these universities include scholars who are worldwide known for their analysis on history, on the Holocaust, and so on. They were never consulted about the definition. We have here a group of politicians that in the last 5 years decide all kinds of things, from what is the Hamas to what is Holocaust denial. And they are targeting communities of scholars, which include scholars who are really the leading scholars on these issues, telling them from a political perspective what they are allowed to say or not allowed to say when they have never consulted them, never used their expertise to come into a more profound, solid definition of whether it's a Holocaust denial, whether it's anti-Semitism, whether it's racism. I think we should take this attack that is manifested in these directives from various ministries and attacked on the very nature of the university. And it's not just about the IHRA, and it's not just about Gaza. It's about the dismal fact that the universities are much more managed corporation than community of scholars. And that is the main reason we are where we are, because if we were able to defend universities as community of scholars and not seeing ourselves as member of a cooperative, a corporation, then we would not have been where we are today. So that's my first point. The second point I would like to make is that there is a prehistory to the history that David gave about the IHRA, which is important to mention. It started as an initiative by the Swedish government. The Swedish Ministry of Education was worried that high school children in Sweden did not know much about the Holocaust. So it started with a benevolent of injecting more information into the Swedish curricula about the Holocaust, and then it was adopted by some other ministries of education in the EU and in Europe as a whole. There is a moment which we have to go back to when Israel usurps this process. It takes it over. It notices, its people notice that there is something here which starts very benevolent, I think, really, with very good intentions, takes it over to weaponize, as it does anti-Semitism, to silence the growing criticism in the civil society, including in the universities, against it, not only its policies, but also against the ideology of the state. So I think it's very important for us as scholars to go back to that moment and identify the criminal act of taking over and abusing the Holocaust memory by weaponizing it in order to silence the debate about Palestine. The third point I would like to make, and that is important, I think, to understand in the historical context, that from very early on, especially Western Europe, and this was, of course, very convenient to Western Germany at the time, very early on, instead of dealing with anti-Semitism as a form of racism, Germany led the way of saying, no, anti-Semitism is different from any other kind of racism. You cannot equate racism with anti-Semitism. Even today, if you go to a German government official, he or she will spend a lot of time explaining to you why you cannot equate anti-Semitism with racism. And the reason was that Zionism was the only solution to this very exceptional kind of racism. And we have to universalize, again, as academics at least, to begin with, racism, not to allow the creation of a hierarchy of racism, not making racism towards Jews as far worse than racism towards Muslims or Hindus or anyone else. And I think that the universalization, both of the Holocaust memory and of racism, and a critical analysis of how Europe used Zionism in a way of absolving itself from dealing with fundamental problems of racism, not just racism against Jews, is something that came back to haunt Europe. And the IHRA definition, very much like the Jewish state in Palestine, are ways of avoiding dealing with the fundamental problems of racism in the European society. We also, as academics, the things we can do, I think, even more, we can also decolonize the Holocaust memory. It's very important to decolonize it because there is a direct connection between the Holocaust and the genocide of indigenous and native people during the colonialist period. Again, something that would allow us to avoid the exceptionalism that is at the very heart of this ability of Israel and its allies to use a definition of Holocaust denial in order to silence criticism on the state and its policies. I would finish by saying that we should insist on examining the manipulation of Holocaust memory. Some of us have already done it, but I think it should be part of a very clear curriculum in the universities. How does one abuse the Holocaust memory? How is it being manipulated and used to justify crimes against humanity, crimes against the Palestinian people, not only against the Palestinian people, also against other people? I think this kind of debates, whether it would be in the form of university seminars, workshops, part of our modules, is our modest contribution, not only for challenging the IHRA, and you know, maybe the pragmatic idea of adopting the Jerusalem version would work. I doubt it. I don't think the Zionist lobby is impressed by the Jerusalem version, and it will not stop it from persecuting us in our universities. But I think at least we should be able, with some courage and some determination and a collective act, actually to bring to the fore discussions, either within the planned curriculum of our department where this discussion would be relevant, or in special events in our universities where we directly challenge, almost very close to the wire, if you want, sailing next to the wind, to make sure that we have a way of exposing the superficiality of the definition, its political context, its very flawed scholarly foundation, and its very clear political objective of silencing a debate that, and I agree with David, that I think in 2025 we have a bit of a better chance of explaining exactly what the IHRA is covering. It's covering or what it helps to immunize and to protect. And this is the daily genocide of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians in the West Bank. I think we have a lot to do. There's a lot we can do, but probably we shouldn't do it alone. We should do it, if possible, in all university kind of networking. But with this, I will finish with the point I started. If we are unable to do it, we will continue to face a real crisis of what our institutions are really for, in this very strong tension between the idea of a university as a management of a corporation and the idea of the university as a community of scholars. And I think we should be able to recruit even more people to this struggle, because, as I say, it's not just about Palestine, and it's not just about the IHRA. It's really is about the way political elites are using knowledge, disseminated, manipulated, and use it as a weapon in order to silence moral positions that seem to them undermining their political careers rather than their system of value. There's very little care about anti-Semitism or Holocaust denial among the British ministers that pressure universities to adopt the IHRA. What they care about is their political career. They are the worst, probably, generation of politicians we've ever seen in this country, self-centered, with very little moral backbone. And we should be able to be courageous enough to tell them that and to face them and use this particular topic in order to challenge the very essence of politics we are facing as a society in Britain and many other places. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ilan, for that talk. I think you are touching on something really fundamental there when you allude to the transition to the neoliberalized, corporatized, overly managerialized, risk-averse university that we have today, which undermines its core purpose as a site of intellectual inquiry. And of course, we have to remember Chomsky's call for the responsibility of the intellectual during the Vietnam War that has been undermined. So there are examples of EDI policies in universities actually being imposed in a performative, neoliberalized fashion, where they're being perverted to actually suppress the very people that they're meant to protect, because they're lacking that power dimension in how they're being implemented. Okay, but thank you so much, Ilan. That was brilliant. We'll have questions at the end, so please hold on to your questions and type them into the Q&A session. I'm delighted now to hand over to Lubna Speitan, please. Thank you.
Hi. Really well-raised points, Ilan, as always, and I think there's no greater insult to the memory of any Holocaust than the current Holocaust and genocide of Palestinians that the world is bearing witness to at present. So I'm Lubna, one of the founding members of GPA, Greenwich Palestine Action. We formed this group once the general onslaught began in October 23. I'm Palestinian, one of many whose family has endured unimaginable loss at the hands of the Israeli state, a regime whose brutality is enabled by its Western imperialist allies. Before this genocide began, my passion was creating art, a way to express beauty and hope. Today, my life is dedicated to activism, pursuing the liberation of my people. Our work is focused on building solidarity with the Palestinian struggle, framed by the global boycott, divestment, and sanction. I'll describe some of the work we've been doing and highlight the challenges we face, particularly the suppression of our movement by mechanisms like the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. Since October 23, GPA has led a series of campaigns. Some of these efforts include pressuring our own and other councils to support a ceasefire and withdraw all direct and indirect investments from Israel. We advocate for the full, immediate and permanent divestment from Israel. We've engaged with council employees whose pensions and deferred wages are used to fund apartheid and genocide. We approached unions, most of which already have policies in place in support of BDS against Israel. We urge them to mobilize and take a stand in solidarity with Palestine through resolutions, public declarations, and strikes. We collaborate with many other groups, with RAF 2D, rank and file trade unionists for divestment from Israel, the longest abbreviation ever. We produced a vast amount of campaign literature, including leaflets, petitions, draft letters to authorities, and model resolutions. We're also pursuing legal action against those complicit in genocide through investments in Israel, and support the cases for arrests of UK citizens complicit in war crimes with the Israeli occupation forces. In our campaigns, we've come up against various forms of state repression. These include arrests being made on spurious grounds of public disorder, anti-Semitism, and the use of anti-terror legislation and PSPOs, that's public space protection orders, to silence speech supporting Palestine. Accusations of anti-Semitism have been made against many activists. You may recall its prominence during the Corbyn era, with smear campaigns being used to suppress free speech and target leading critics of Israeli apartheid. Some of many to name along with Jeremy Corbyn included Jackie Walker, Chris Williamson, Mark Wadsworth, Ken Livingstone, and our host here, Tony Greenstein. The non-legally binding IHRA definition was adopted around this time of 2016 to further silence advocates for Palestinian rights. Following the increased denial of democracy when it came to Palestinian rights, we understood that without challenging the very barriers placed before us, that other elements of our campaigns would be difficult to achieve. In our local divestment campaign, the council has continually obfuscated, attempted to stifle free speech, deny local democracy, and accuse pro-Palestine protesters of anti-Semitism. And I must stress here, we did issue a complaint and pursue that, and we did receive acknowledgement and a written and public apology. This must be challenged. The dismissal of our concerns and complete lack of solidarity with Palestine reflected an underpinning of racism when it comes to Palestinians. Many have become nervous to speak out in support of Palestine with fear of being slapped with the anti-Semite stick or losing the Labour whip. The IHRA definition is at the heart of these false accusations of anti-Semitism. It's politically motivated and has been weaponized to suppress legitimate criticism of Israel and advocacy for Palestinian rights. Most of the examples provided with the definition refer to Israel. It conflates anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism and defines it as anti-Semitic to describe Israel as a racist endeavor. Yet Israel is a racist endeavor. It is a racist, ethno-nationalist apartheid state founded on supremacist policies that can only exist on the subjugation of my indigenous Palestinian people, a people paying the price for welcoming those persecuted by Europe and the West, who then, with the help of Mr. Balfour, gave them our land, a land they had no right to give, yet we have paid the price for their crimes since. The definition has been actively promoted by the Israeli government, attacking free speech, protest, and human rights advocacy. It's enabled false accusations against students, academics, advocates, activists, and anti-Zionist Jews, and has been condemned by many human rights organizations. Its original author, Kenneth Stern, as has already been mentioned, has publicly opposed its institutional adoption on the grounds that it endangers free speech. The definition undermines the fight against genuine anti-Jewish hate and fosters a dangerous hierarchy of racism, as Ilan pointed out. It's discriminatory against Arabs, who are also Semitic people, irrespective of attempts made to coin, redefine, and alter the meaning of the word for political or racist agendas, further fueling the narratives that deny our existence and identity. The Semitic language, including Arabic, Hebrew, Aramaic, belongs to those native to the region. It does not encompass those coming from Europe, Russia, America. We are Semites. The IHRA definition of anti-Semitism further marginalizes Palestinian voices, delegitimizes anti-Zionist Jewish perspectives, and violates fundamental freedoms protected under the Human Rights Act, Equality Act, and international law. Those who continue to uphold a definition that attempts to shield a racist entity as it carries out a genocide are also complicit. The ICJ has issued warnings already on the matter of complicity. We recognize that Israel is an apartheid state built upon the dispossession and subjugation of Palestinian people. We insist upon our right to name and oppose it. We call upon institutions to take a principled and determined stand against all forms of racism, including anti-Palestinian racism, and immediately rescind endorsement of the IHRA definition and reject any replacement, which includes the Jerusalem Declaration, similarly flawed. And there are attentions I will draw to that. I won't elaborate, but on 10b, those of you who are familiar with it, that raises great issues on the points. So I'm just going to bring that up to refer to it. It states ultimately that Jews have the right to flourish in Israel. Again, legitimizing Israel. Everyone has a right to flourish, but not by subjugating another people and the natives of that land. And so I would like to raise that as a point, and we do not endorse that definition either. We'd like to add here more to the point of that, what use of equality acts and anti-discrimination policies and laws if there is to be accepted a definition, not only creating a superiority of one people's rights over others, but also serving as a means to make acceptable a racist entity whose existence is based upon the suppression of others, as well as attempting to legitimize an illegitimate state. I'd like to finally mention briefly the archival research we've carried out, recovering declarations and actions from the 1980s by councils that quite rightly stood firmly against South African apartheid. They committed to the BDS campaigns and declared themselves anti-apartheid zones. Today, these same councils fail to uphold these principles when it comes to Israeli apartheid. Instead, they remain complicit in both Israel's apartheid regime and genocidal actions. We ask all councils and institutions to honor their past commitments opposing apartheid and racism. We understand that many who endorse the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism may not have fully understood the grave consequences of doing so. We hope that you now will acknowledge the mistakes made, put this injustice right, and rescind the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. To fellow activists, please feel welcome to get in touch. We're happy to share our resolutions, literature, and experience with you. We also very much welcome your input. We must all continue to resist injustice and support the right of all oppressed people to their right of self-determination and resistance by any means, including under the UN Charter and international law, the right to armed struggle. It is imperative to stand firm in the fight for liberation. Thank you all so much for your contributions.
Thank you so much, Lubna. That was amazing. So important to point to the tools that the state is using to repress and stifle free speech, and the role of the IHRA definition. But not only that, also the problematic other definitions, such as the JGA in that, and the fact that the Palestinians are the ones who pay the price for that, the highest price. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Okay. I'm going to hand over now to Jonathan Rosenhead as our next speaker. Thank you very much.
First of all, I should apologise for the fact that I am not Naomi Wimborne-Idrissi, which is what it says on my picture. I hope my colleague Naomi, who lent me her Zoom entry card, is somewhere in the audience, but I couldn't get in as myself. But we are comrades, previously in the British Committee for the University of Palestine together, and currently in Jewish Voice for Labour. I think I found what Lubna said very moving, and also it's an example, many of the things she brought out, an example of so many people who are progressive except on Palestine. And that's an issue that we have to deal with, and we have to understand how that came about. Okay, I'm just clearing the screen. So a couple of things happened to me this week which are relevant. So I'm going to start there. On Wednesday, I was at a book launch by a Palestinian friend of mine, and I went up to her at the end to get my book, which I'd bought, signed, and there were some other Palestinians around. And I mentioned the fact that I was going to be speaking at this meeting, and I mentioned some of the people who were speaking. And the reaction from my Palestinian comrades was, that's an awful lot of Jews, more or less. I didn't use those exact words, but you know, this is, after all, a Palestinian issue, not an issue for British Jews to be holding forth on. And of course, that is an issue which has been brought up repeatedly by Palestinian campaigners in this country. We don't want to talk about Jews. We don't want to talk about anti-Semitism. We want to talk about Israel and about the suppression of Palestinians. So why am I here? Well, partly because we are having a meeting about the use and misuse of anti-Semitism as a weapon in the fight to suppress Palestinians. And it's not something that we can actually ignore. It has been extremely effective. As we saw in the case of Jeremy Corbyn, they tried in every which way to get him out of the leadership of the Labour Party. They tried him being unpatriotic. They tried this, they tried that. The one thing that worked is anti-Semitism, because nobody knows with a sufficient clarity what is and isn't anti-Semitic, and therefore many people were persuaded that there's no smoke without fire, and if so many people are saying that he's anti-Semitic, well, presumably that is the case. And the reason why it worked was, more than anything, the IHRA definition, which gave a gloss of authority to the idea that people who were criticizing Israel were actually doing it for other reasons. So I can understand that my Palestinian comrades on Wednesday were surprised there were so many Jews involved. In fact, there was due to be one more, which was Tony Lerman, and I wish he'd been here because he, of course, has written a book about the definition. However, what I did yesterday was, with Naomi, we ran an anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism workshop. We've been running these in Jewish Voice for Labour for several years. We've probably done 40 or 50 of them. We had 10 or 15 or 20, I can't remember exactly, people, and we discussed for a couple of hours how to understand better what anti-Semitism actually is and to distinguish it from anti-Zionism. So that is an educational task, which is difficult because of the definition, but we need to undermine the definition. This is one way in which we can do it. People have been confused, and we need to help them to be less confused. I should say that I got to about the age of 60 without worrying about anti-Semitism, which is not to say I wasn't worried about anti-Semitism. I wasn't worried about what it meant. I knew it existed. I'd been subject to mild forms of it myself. Swathes of my family, second cousins and beyond, were exterminated in the war, and so on. But at least I and everybody else in the country thought they knew what anti-Semitism was. Some people had a more sophisticated understanding. Some people had a less sophisticated understanding. But everybody knew it was about people who didn't like Jews and said or did things about them or to them. It was definable, as indeed Brian Klug, one of the people who are very good in this field, it can be defined in as little as 22 words rather than the hundreds which the IHRA definition uses to try and escape from the fact that anti-Semitism is dislike or hatred of Jews, with a few extra words added in. And there was a deliberate campaign from the 1990s, the mid-1990s onwards, to conflate anti-Semitism with anti-Israelism. It was to say it's more complicated than that. Israel is the only Jewish state, therefore people who are attacking it are doing it because it's Jewish, and they don't attack other countries that do the same. Well, of course, that's nonsense. People who do immoral and illegal things get criticized by the people who care about it, and we care. A large section, not a majority, but a large section of the Jewish population in this country, and an increasingly large proportion, care about what Israel is doing because it implicates Jews, because they say they're doing it for all the Jews in the world, and they're not doing it for us. The definition itself was a reaction to the Durban Conference on Racism, which was the one which held that that Zionism was racism, and this put shockwaves through the Jewish establishment. And they tried to find out ways of seeing how widespread this sort of anti-Semitism was, and that's how the definition emerged, as a way of counting up the things that people said that might conceivably be related to anti-Semitism if they were anti-Semitic. But of course, then it got diverted, not into a way of seeing how serious the problem was, but into defining who was and who wasn't an anti-Semite. Following the Durban conference, we had the launch of boycott, divestment and sanction as part of the most effective Palestinian counterattack against what the Israelis were doing. And that really put the wind up the Israelis. They founded the Ministry of Strategic Affairs in 2009, gave it very large budgets to fight it. And among the things that they claim to have been able to do from Israel is to close down many bank accounts, which are supporting boycott, divestment and sanction. They financed legal fights to try and change the law in various countries. They provide funding to many US NGOs, and of course much other funding that we don't know about. And they support generalized what's called Hasbara, which is propaganda. They have networks where they send out messages which should be used by supporters of Israel around the world. And that was largely because of the threat of academic boycott. The Reuben Rivlin, who was then the Speaker of the Knesset and became the next president of Israel, said that academic boycott is an existential threat to the state of Israel. And they campaigned, they concentrated on fighting boycott, and academic boycott in particular. So the original definition, which was to count up instances of things that could be anti-Semitic, was converted in the beginning of this century into the EUMC definition, which never got anywhere. And but then it was adopted by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and that word Holocaust gave it the thrust. It sanctified the definition, and we need to bear that in mind, because right now there is a Holocaust going on, and it's going on in Palestine, and it's the Holocaust Remembrance Alliance is one of the weaponized organizations that supports Israel. It's I could go into more on that, but there are a lot of them around. As well as not worrying about what anti-Semitism was, I didn't worry about the Israel lobby, because I knew we didn't have one in this country. I was rather foolish, of course. I thought it only existed in the United States. And we do have our domestic Israel lobby, as we've been finding out. The Al Jazeera programs, 4 programs on the lobby, are very worth seeing to see to what extent there has been penetration of various parts of the UK world by people who support Israel. And I became fully aware of it on one occasion when a group of us were meeting with Peter Oborn, who's the distinguished and honorable journalist. And he was going to do a review of a dreadful book by Tom Bauer, which was how shall I put it, got a press attempt to demonize Jeremy Corbyn. He asked people in from Jewish for Labour to tell him how many errors, how many lies, how many omissions there were there. So we did that for him, and he wrote a good review. But on the way to the tube station afterwards, he came with us and he said, in answer to a question, I think from me, which was the reason why you can't get your message into the media is because, and he said he'd spoken to an editor about why that was. And he said, well, if you do it, they come at you from all angles. They come at you from the left, they come at you from the right, from above, from below. You unleash a torrent of people who have some kind of possibility of influencing your ability to keep on in your job, for example. So we have this lobby. It's a UK-Israel lobby. It's not just Jewish. Many of the prominent members are not Jewish. It's not a Jewish conspiracy. If you take Tom Bauer, who wrote that awful book, if you take Luke Akehurst, who's now an MP and was the leader of the right wing in eliminating Corbyn from the Labour leadership, if you talk about Eric Pickles, who is has been the anti-Semitism, all these are non-Jews who adopt the same position. I think the conclusion is that there is an elite club whose entry price is to support Israel. And it's not just Jews, it's other people as well. The club is multi-faith, multi-ethnic. Many factors lead to their support for Israel, the support for capitalism, etc., the need to keep our hands on the Middle East oil, all that sort of thing. There are different reasons for different people. There doesn't need to be a conspiracy, although I'm sure they talk to each other, because they all understand that they're in it together. And I think that the vice-chancellors, who are so willing to suppress freedom of speech in their own universities, are aware that that's the club that they, as leaders of a corporate university, have the possibility of joining, and that's why they support it. Coming towards the end, I think I must be more or less out of time. The IHRA definition proved a crucial weapon to the UK, the US, worldwide Israel lobby, because of its linkage to the Holocaust, because of the guilt which so many people around the world feel about what happened to the Jews in Second World War, and because of the uncertainty and ignorance about what is anti-Semitism, and they've been sold a bill of goods. And it's not that they necessarily accept the IHRA definition as a statement of fact, but it's given them a worry that they might be saying something anti-Semitic, so they keep quiet. And pro-Palestinian advocacy has been seriously affected by the shadow of this definition. The potency, unfortunately, is still undiminished. But we have a population now which is absolutely convinced of the awfulness of the Israeli regime. They don't necessarily know the full details, but we now have a total distinction between our leadership, which is pro-Palestinian, pro-Israel, and a population which has had it with Israel and will have had it for another generation or two. It may be hard to get the IHRA definition deleted. They control that political playing field, but the thing that we can do as people who aren't in the elite group is we can do boycott. We can do boycott in our universities. It was, after all, the academic boycott which most frightened Reuben Rivlin. And I think that if we can get together in our universities and in our other places to support boycott, that is the way to, that is our field, it's not their field, and we can make progress and help Palestinians to what they should rightly have. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Great, for those great insights and the call for boycott. And many important things you said there. I picked up also on the progressives and their the Palestine exception, apparently from many progressives, academics in particular, who have been speaking out about decolonizing higher education and decolonizing the curriculum since, well, way back, and reinforced through the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020. They're now completely silenced. So that's worth thinking about. How can we change that? Well, thank you so much, Jonathan. Much appreciated. I'm gonna hand over now to. I'm just gonna check with Tony. Is Tony Lerman? Has he arrived, or is he still on the run somewhere? Or
no, Tony Lerman won't be able to make it because he's traveling between an airport and his home. His flight was delayed. So
I see.
unfortunately, he won't be able to make it.
Okay, but we are still lucky that we do have another Tony, who is Tony Greenstein. So I'm going to hand over to you now, Tony, for to conclude the final part of the speaker session, and then we're going to open up the floor to questions. Over to you, Tony.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure how maybe you can spotlight me. I'm not sure if I can do that myself. But welcome everyone, and thank you for coming to this webinar. We have over 300 people here now who've been in this session. I really want to pick up on something firstly that Ilan Pappe said about the retreat of the universities and their buckling under, thanks to Gavin Williamson's threats of defunding. Ilan quoted Noam Chomsky's responsibility of the intellectuals, but I would like to quote an essay by George Orwell on the cowardice of intellectuals, because I think that's also true, that with remarkably few exceptions, intellectuals and academics have not spoken up against what is happening. And there's been no excuse. I mean, when I read the diaries of Victor Klemperer, who was a Christian Jew in Nazi Germany, who was removed from his teaching post, he remarked that the only one of his colleagues who came to bid him goodbye in 1935, when he was removed, was the cleaner. None of his academic colleagues did. Now, I guess there is some excuse because they were living in a Nazi terror state, but that isn't the case today. Whatever else we can say about Britain, it's not a Nazi police state. You're not likely to be hauled off by the Gestapo and tortured. So the failure of most academics to speak up at the time about what Gavin Williamson was doing and to call him out, I think it is an extremely black mark over those academics. I really want to progress from there. I also think what Ilan raised was a very interesting debate about what is the role of the university in a capitalist society, the tension between serving the interests of businesses and their role in being a forum for scholastic inquiry. And that's tension that's not going to be resolved anytime soon, but it is important that we mention it. But I'm struck by the IHRA because I'm reminded of something Karl Marx said in the German ideology, which is that the ruling ideas in any society are the ideas of the ruling class. I'm paraphrasing that. And that seems to be extremely clear about the IHRA. I mean, if you look at it, the IHRA is vague, it's unclear, it's rambling, there's no consistent theme, and yet it's been adopted as the gold standard, as the definition of anti-Semitism. And this is quite amazing. And this, if you like, is a good example of how ideas become dominant in the society that we live in. For example, Donald Trump has threatened universities and gone ahead with it, with defunding, because they're not protecting Jewish students on campus. His concern over anti-Semitism is amazing when you think about it. I mean, here is someone who is a prime example of a racist, someone who describes neo-Nazis at the Charlottesville march as very fine people, a person who's trying to impose standards so that anti-discrimination is taken even out of British law as a price for a trading agreement, a man who is a bigot in every sense possible, and yet he is concerned about anti-Semitism. And no one asks why this is so, or what is this anti-Semitism that Trump and the right wing are so concerned about. And it often makes me think, I mean, all of those who are, as I say, concerned about anti-Semitism and interested in conflating anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, if you look at them, the far right, Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, the AfD in Germany, Marine Le Pen, and so on. And I ask myself, where would those people have been 90 or 100 years ago Jews were being deported from Germany and where the Aryan paragraph was being instituted in the Netherlands. Would they have been speaking out against anti-Semitism? It's very hardly likely. Geert Wilders would have been a member of the NSB, the Dutch fascist party, which did the bidding of the Nazi occupiers in the Netherlands. And the same applies to all of the far right who now portray themselves as friends of the Jews. So there is a complete and utter hypocrisy about this. And the first thing really one needs to say about the IHRA is that whatever else it isn't a definition of anti-Semitism. And people get worked up about anti-Semitism and what it is. But it's really very simple. It's in the Oxford English Dictionary. It was before the present rumpus occurred, which is hostility to or prejudice against Jews as Jews. It's as simple as that. I mean, my father took part in the Battle of Cable Street. People might not be aware of this. On the 4th of October 1936, a few thousand black shirts, the British Union of Fascists and National Socialists, as they were called, tried to march through London. And something like 200,000 people, most of them actually non-Jewish, Catholic dockers and so on, physically stopped them marching through. And you know something? My father did not need a definition of anti-Semitism to know what it was. And so this idea that we need a definition of anti-Semitism in order to fight it is an absolute and complete nonsense. The purpose of the IRA is so obvious and so clear, and it really does have nothing at all to do with anti-Semitism. And Ilan again spoke about the weaponization and the misuse of Holocaust memory. And I've often said that although Israel claims to inherit the memory of those who died in the Holocaust, in reality, what it's doing is inheriting the memory of those who killed the Jews who died in the Holocaust. We see that in Israel today. It is no exaggeration to say that the one lesson that Israel has learned, Zionism has learned from the Holocaust, is that it gives them the right to perpetrate their own Holocaust. Because I've written a book about this, Zionism during the Holocaust, that Zionism is very clear that the Holocaust is their precious asset. The Holocaust is unique. You cannot interpret the Holocaust. You cannot universalize its lessons. It is peculiar to the Jewish people, to Israel, and to Zionism. And we see that today. I mean, I caught an article, it's in the New Arab on the 7th of May. Ilan Barashi, who's a famous Israeli producer, he posted on Twitter, "Good morning, let there be a Shoah," that is a Holocaust, in Gaza. And he followed that up by, "I can't understand the people here in the state of Israel who don't want to fill Gaza with gas showers or train cars and finish this story. Let there be a Holocaust in Gaza." In fact, he's not alone, of course. Bezalel Smotrich, who is the Minister of Finance, no less, in the Israeli government. He's openly declared that he wants to starve 2 million people to death. He says it would be moral, but unfortunately the world won't let him do it. Well, he was wrong when he said that. It was back in April, because we're quite clearly seeing after 2 months of a starvation blockade that the world is allowing it. Not one word has come from Starmer or any of the Labour cabinet, to say nothing, of course, of Trump and the rest of the European leaders, not least Ursula von Leyen, the European Commissioner. They are quite happy to see the starvation taking place in Gaza today, which is another Holocaust. Let's be quite clear about that. And if we go on to the IHRA itself, I just want to say a few words. It starts off with a 38-word definition. And the core of that is anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. There's been a number of comments, and I want to quote Hugh Tomlinson, who gave an opinion, a legal opinion. He's a barrister and a KC. And he said the use of the language is unusual and therefore potentially confusing. The phrase "a certain perception" is vague and unclear in the context of a definition. there is likely to be a lack of consistency in its application and a potential chilling effect on public bodies, which in the absence of definitional clarity may seek to sanction or prohibit any conduct which has been labelled by third parties as anti-Semitic, without applying any clear criterion of assessment. That opinion was given in 2016, and it was commissioned by, amongst others, Jewish Voice for Labour. And he was absolutely correct. It's precisely the lack of clarity and the vagueness of the IHRA which has made it such a potent weapon. If the IHRA had simply come out and said anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, then people would have reacted against it. It didn't do that. It couched it in very difficult and unclear and inconsistent wording. And that's why I think it's been so successful. I mean, David Feldman, who's the director of the Institute of Anti-Semitism at Birkbeck, described it in a Guardian article as bewilderingly imprecise. Jeffrey Robinson, in another legal opinion, which was commissioned, he's a famous human rights lawyer in the KC too, simply said the definition is not fit for purpose, or any purpose that relies upon it to identify anti-Semitism accurately. By pivoting upon racial hatred, a crime to stir up in this country, it fails to catch those who exhibit hostility and prejudice or apply discrimination. And that is absolutely correct. The IHRA defines anti-Semitism as hatred, although the definition itself, a 38-word definition, doesn't seem to apply to any of the illustrations. That's one of the even more confusing things about it. But it's quite clear that anti-Semitism isn't just hatred. If I say, for example, I don't want my daughter to marry someone who's Jewish, I mean, I don't hate Jews, I just don't want her to mix with them. That's not hatred, but it's certainly a dislike. And the IHRA doesn't cover, for example, that. And I agree with Jonathan Rosenhead, incidentally. I regret the fact that we're even having to talk about anti-Semitism at a time like this. But unfortunately, it has become the key weapon of not just the Zionist movement, but the ruling class as a whole against the Palestinians, especially at a time like that. And not surprisingly, one of the illustrations is drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. That's the 10th out of the 11 illustrations. And yet we see when the war was declared, inverted commas, war, by Yoav Gallant, he called the Palestinians human animals. And that was exactly the precise phrase used by Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, which implemented the final solution in October the 4th, 1943, when he was talking about Jews and other non-Aryans. So we can actually see the symmetry between Israel today and and Nazi Germany itself, the ideological symmetry, and also many of the practical applications as well. I mean, most people will not know that the Nazis did not turn to gas chambers until the end of 1941. They began shooting people, the Einsatzgruppen it was, with Operation Barbarossa, but for a number of reasons that did not prove effective. They experimented, and one of the experiments was with explosives, but they were not successful. I suspect that if they had had the 2,000-pound bunker buster bombs that Israel has been using in built-up areas, they may well have reconsidered their decision to use gas. In other words, that Israel is actually exterminating people in Gaza. And when the final toll is counted, I mean, it was 200,000, it was estimated by researchers in the Lancet, and that was over a year ago. I suspect it's actually near 500,000, not the official figures of people who've been identified. For whatever reason, the number of people who are identified seems to be a very small fraction of those who died. And I just want to give one more example of how the IHRA is mendacious. One of the least controversial illustrations is the 9th illustration, which says it's anti-Semitic to use the symbols and images associated with classic anti-Semitism for instance, claims of Jews killing Jesus or the blood libel, to characterize Israel or Israelis. Well, one of those examples was that Jews used to poison the wells of non-Jews, and this resulted in Easter in pogroms and so on. But it's a fact, an indisputable fact, that Israel has poisoned Palestinian water sources. It did that in the Nakba. It was an operation called Cast Thy Bread, and it's been documented in Israel from the archives, where dysentery bacteria was introduced into the water supplies of Akko, resulting in severe illnesses, deaths, and so on. We know for a fact that settlers regularly poisoned the wells and the water sources of Palestinians in the West Bank. So what we see is actually Israel living up to the worst anti-Semitic caricatures when they carry out their massacres and their bombings and all the rest of their actions. So I will leave it at that, because I probably got over my 10 minutes by now, but the chair's been very kind to me, and just say the main thing we have to do is to actually build a resistance in the universities. And I think there really does need to be a pushback now of all times against the IHRA, and to say it is not acceptable as any form of definition of anti-Semitism. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Tony, for that brilliant account there. I think you're absolutely right. It's the vagueness that does the job. And we could see this certainly at the Open University when we had the Senate debates. So many colleagues were just fearful of just even engaging in the debate, for fear of being labeled anti-Semitic. People don't want to be called anti-Semitic. That's
why they call it.
Yeah. Or racist, or any kind of racist. And of course, I think this is also exacerbated by the identity politics that's going on in contemporary society, superficial and performative enactments of EDI policies that we see in the neoliberalized university. So many sort of entangling issues there that work to silence people. So thank you so much to you, Tony, and thank you to all of our speakers for their really insightful talks. We've come to the end of our talks now, and I'm going to open the floor to questions. I've noted down a few practical questions to begin with that perhaps we can start with, and then go into the more sort of intellectual issues after that. So the first one is that it's been asked a couple of times, will the recording be shared and how? So there is a recording, yeah, what we're doing here is being recorded, but Tony, perhaps you can just clarify where the recording will be made available. Will it be sent to participants afterwards, or will it be uploaded somewhere?
It will be on the JNP website, and I can make it available. It will probably be on my blog as well. And if you want, or any of the speakers want a copy, then I can simply WeTransfer it. So as soon as it will take some time for it to process. It's usually about an hour. It takes Zoom itself to do that. But as soon as I've got it, I'll get it sent, the link to all the speakers. Yeah, and JNP itself will put it on its own website. Chaim will do that. And anyone else, if JVL wants to do that, or whoever, it will be freely available. It won't be copyrighted, I promise you.
That's great. Thank you for clarifying that. Yeah, so the aim is to use this as a resource for
Absolutely,
others who might like to, see how you can build a resistance. There have been quite a few questions coming in from NHS workers, actually. So I don't know if this is representative of a wider issue in the NHS, but I think that's a demand for knowledge on this apparently in the NHS. Somebody else, just before I go on to the more intellectual questions, there was another practical question which I wanted to or a comment rather actually, which I wanted to mention. It's from Dennis Baden. He says that would it be okay to announce this and post it in the comments? He doesn't want to do so without permission. You have my permission. A group of students and staff are developing a campaign against the University of Hertfordshire's surreptitious adoption of the IHRA definition. if you would like to help build this and expand this campaign, please contact me. And the email is in the Q&A, but I'll paste it here in the chat as well. So it's great if we can, exchange ideas with one another and support each other's initiatives like this. Right. Okay. Let me get on to the first question now then. I think a very important question that is to the point is, all panelists, do we need a specific definition for different types of prejudice for different groups of people, or can we just call racism racism? Don't different definitions encourage a hierarchy of racism? That's a very good question, I think. If I can maybe hand over to, okay, anybody who would particularly like to start off answering that question?
Okay, I mean, I'll take it if you want.
Go ahead, Tony.
I don't see anti-Semitism in Western Europe, in Britain in particular, as a form of racism. I think racism expresses an imbalance of power. It is the power of the state to do what it wants. And it does that through the racial division of labour, through creating a precariat, through creating a migrant labour, which is uncertain of its status and so on. That is also imported from our colonial traditions in the first place. Anti-Semitism was a problem in the 30s and the 40s. I mean, I've been reading books by the 43 group who fought fascism after the war, and the police would call them Jewish bastards, and it's a pity that Hitler didn't get you and things like that. You don't see that in the police today. I was arrested last October for making a speech comparing Israel to the Nazis by police who are worried about anti-Semitism. I mean, there's been a sea change, but of course there's a redefinition of anti-Semitism. So no, anti-Semitism today is a marginal prejudice in Britain and most of Western Europe. I'm not saying in Eastern Europe it doesn't still have real roots, but that's a different question. It's being weaponized, of course, against Palestinians who do experience, and not only Palestinians, real racism. I'm not really in favor of these separate definitions of racism. I mean, I think you can have one form of one definition which covers everything. If you discriminate or hate or feel hostility towards any group on account of their particular characteristics, that's racism. It doesn't take a genius to work it out.
I'd like to come in after Tony. Yes.
Sorry,
I agree with Tony on that last point. Now, I do think the IHRA definition is a very bad example, and it set other people up copying the same example. If the Jews can have their definition, why can't we have one too? Otherwise, the Jews are being privileged. So there's a competition to come up with a whole range of separate definitions, whereas actually racism is one thing expressed in different ways, and it's no point in fighting them separately. We need to generate a sense of citizenship and comradeship in which everybody will be willing to oppose racisms of all kinds when they encounter it. I think it's not I would disagree with Tony that anti-Semitism is no longer a problem. Anti-Semitism is a form of racism, is much milder and much less frequent than other forms of racism in this country. That's no reason why we should say it doesn't matter. I think we should fight all racisms, and people will concentrate on the racisms that they find particularly offensive or dangerous. But anti-Jewish racism is still existing. There are people actually in the pro-Palestine movement who, because they see Israel as the enemy, associate that with Jews, and there is anti-Semitism within the pro-Palestine movement, and that's dangerous for the movement. We need to be clean. We need to be clear that no form of racism is acceptable.
Great. Thanks so much, both of you. Anybody else from the panel wants to come in on this one? Why do we need a separate definition on anti-Semitism?
I don't mind. Sorry.
Sorry, go ahead, Lubna.
I think I touched on this when I was speaking about the fact that there shouldn't be, ideally, any definition. That's what we have Equalities Acts for, and anti-discriminatory policies, and what use is that if there is going to be a superiority of one people over another? I don't think it's necessary. I think that they just need to abide by that. Racism is racism against anyone, and we should challenge that on a whole equally. That's my bottom line.
Thank you for that. Yeah, maybe just to add myself here from the point of view of the debates at the Open University, there was a question posed, I recall, in the debate as to whether a separate definition of anti-Semitism was needed when we already had the Equality Act of 2010. There was also a question asked as to whether we needed a definition of Islamophobia. And that actually brings me to another question here by Chella Ward, who wanted to ask David at the OU. He's now had to go to a concert for his birthday, but she wanted to ask why that definition of anti-Semitism came about. And on behalf of David, I think I can say that it actually did come out as a result of the IHRA definition and the JDA definition that was adopted, because there was a question as part of that debate. Yeah, why do we need one for anti-Semitism? Do we not also need one for Islamophobia then? And a few years later, so it would have been like 4 years later, we finally have that as well, yeah? So that's a natural consequence of that. Okay, anybody else from the panel wants to come in on this one, why we need a separate one? That's it, yeah? So let's see here what else, what other questions we have. There are quite a few questions from the NHS, which is interesting. Somebody is asking, Zara Awale is asking, can the IHRA definition be used in a public institution, for instance, the NHS, to set up a terms of reference for a staff Jewish network? And how can this stand if it suppresses freedom of speech and expression? Does anybody want to come in on that?
It's bad under all circumstances. It's an incoherent, totally biased definition, which nobody should use. It shouldn't be used for a staff association or the NHS as a whole. It's basically a pile of rubbish, but it's been brought in for sectarian purposes to defend Israel, and nobody should be using it.
Okay. Thank you, Jonathan. Another NHS worker here, I think, Huda Al-Haditi, is asking how, hello, I would really like to know, as professionals, healthcare workers in the NHS, what steps we should take when we are accused of anti-Semitism just for talking about Gaza. Ilan, do you want to come in on this one?
Maybe, I don't know. It's a very general question that probably everybody experiences it individually in a different way. But I do think that one of the most important things about challenging the equation of anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism is to demand to have some time and space to explain. I think one of the things we can't do is with a soundbite challenge that equation. And if people are willing to listen and are giving you the space and time, I think it doesn't take too long to provide a very convincing explanation with an historical context and with a more kind of principled context why you cannot equate anyway ideology and religion, and therefore you cannot equate being against a religion with being against an ideology. And of course, this is an important point because of the way we understand that ideology is not necessarily subscribed to only by Jews. There are a lot of non-Jewish Zionists, and there are many Jews who are anti-Zionists. It's amazing that these simple facts are not known and usually are not discussed because the mainstream media doesn't cover it up. Our history books in the mainstream academia and educational system doesn't cover it. But that's where I think we can use time and space to just give the the context, but in which Zionism emerged, the way Zionism today, what does this ideology produce on the ground in terms of war crimes and crimes against humanity, and then, of course, explaining that, like any other monotheistic religion, Judaism has many faces, many interpretations, but they are really not relevant to the colonialist project that is oppressing the Palestinians. The quicker we are able, I think, to divert the discussion to the real issues, which is the genocide of the Palestinians that has not started on the 7th of October 2023, the quicker we can divert and explain to people that this is the moral urgency, this is the political urgency, is to defend the Palestinians from what goes on the ground, and explain that actually engaging us in the debate on anti-Semitism is a means of diverting us from dealing with what we really should deal with. It's very important. It's very important to point out that although the discussion is important and can be done, when it is engaged in the context of what Israel is doing and what Palestinians are suffering from, it is not meant to help us understand better what's going on. It's actually meant to obfuscate the reality, to hide the reality. And this is very, very important. And we should not let people determine and own the conversation. We should demand what the conversation should be like, should be about. And I think that is something that probably some of us who are a bit older just gained a lot of hours of experience in doing it, and we are getting much better. I used to look at some meetings I had 40 years ago. I was not as good at doing it as I am now. There's no substitute for experience in this. You need a lot of hours of debating and so on, but we can share that knowledge. And I think that this is important to do it together, to learn together from each other, and be able to have a firm position that, yes, one can engage in a longer conversation about it if one wants to, but insist on the context of where this conversation is leading to, and what is the purpose of having this conversation. And I think many of us are already doing it. And when we are in a public debate or a public appearance and people are asking us these questions, I think we are able to divert back to the real issues that are at hand. And I think this is something that can be done logically, practically, and very effectively, provided you're not intimidated by this allegation, because it's a very powerful allegation, and some of the speakers alluded to that, and it has paralyzed people. It has, you need some modicum of courage, I suppose, to deal with it. But as Tony said, looking at the history of people who really faced a real danger, existential danger for expressing their positions, in Britain we can still do it relatively in a free way. And of course, yes, I'm not underestimating the fact that people have been suspended, people's career have been threatened, especially after the 7th of October. So I'm not going to undermine this. And the legal system is even used against them. But I think that at least those of us who are seeing themselves as people who are engaged in this issue should really determine the context and the right reference to this issue, both with the knowledge of it, but also of making sure that it's not used as a diversion and weaponized as a silencer.
I understood part of the question was, what happens if you as an individual are accused of anti-Semitism, particularly because of things you say about Israel? And the answer must be to try and find colleagues and comrades where you work who will agree with you. If possible, if you've got a good trade union, get in touch with your branch and look to defend yourself if you feel threatened. If it's not a direct threat, then think about organizing with colleagues to have a discussion group about the nature of Zionism and anti-Zionism, and start to increase the level of understanding among your colleagues so you'll have more support.
Can I just come in briefly? If people are being told that you can't discuss support for Palestine because it will upset Jewish patients, I think you have to respond by saying that is in itself anti-Semitic, because you're assuming that in being Jewish in Britain means you're a supporter of genocide. And if some Jewish people do support the genocide, all I can say is, would you not have opposed apartheid in South Africa because you had a white South African in hospital? I mean, it's a completely absurd thing. You judge things on what happens. I mean, in America, in the 1930s, students and staff who demonstrated against the German ambassador visiting those universities were suspended, or in the case of Columbia, actually expelled, because, of course, giving offense to Germans by opposing Nazism was considered a crime. Well, that's what they're really saying today. It has nothing to do with being Jewish in this society. Jews do not have an obligation to support Israel. So I think people need to be clear about that.
Okay, thank you so much, all of you.
I've got a question from Naomi, by the way. She says it hasn't been taken. Can I just read it out?
Is it the panelists reflect on the...
Okay, yeah, okay.
Yeah, I was
worried about it. That was all.
Yeah.
Sorry.
There are two, at least, anyway, about the states, the United States. But let's take Naomi's here. Can panelists reflect on the effect of Trump-style hostility to scholarship spreading to other countries on efforts to campaign in defense of academic freedom? And there's another question. Let me just take that as well, because it's similar, by Mahmoud Khan. Is there something we can learn from Harvard? Thanks for the excellent talks.
Well, as I said before, I think this is something we can galvanize a far wider coalition than we presently have, because it's not just about Gaza. This is about the relationship between ourselves as academics and our managements on the one hand, and our management's relationship with the political and financial elite. And for too long, I think we haven't discussed this issue. Academics are very good in analyzing other people's motives, behaviors, and history. They're very bad in doing it for themselves. They rarely do it. And maybe that's a wake-up call for us, first of all, to look inside and see what is our function, what is our role in society. And that would help to, I think, draft and articulate better our position vis-a-vis, especially in public universities, vis-a-vis political elites that fund our institutions, and also maybe assess again what is our potential in challenging. Are we totally powerless because the funding is coming from politicians who decide on budgets, or do we have a power to be part of a union and part of trade unions altogether? And make sure that we have a presence. In many ways, that is what's so unfortunate, that the terrible genocide of Gaza has exposed so many general issues that were not dealt with. Another example, I just give it in a very short way, is not just academic freedom. The whole system of international law that the West had built after the Second World War without consultation of the colonized world, as if Western values are universal values, is collapsing in front of our eyes because of Gaza. If the international justice system had a moment it could shine through and show that it is universal, contrary to the suspicion in the global South that it is not, it had totally failed to do so in front of the situation in Gaza. So unfortunately, that horrible tragedy is reopening questions that have long been left as taken for granted and should not be challenged. And one of them is indeed the definition of academic freedom. And what does it mean? And this whole culture that used supposedly unbiased, objective scientific research in order to discourage academics from having moral positions is also something that should be part of what we call now decolonizing knowledge, but we have to be careful not to be mesmerized by the American jargon that usually has a lot of beautiful words that doesn't mean much. And we need to make sure that these are exactly accessible ideas that define very clearly our responsibility. And I agree with Tony. It's not just about having the right to talk, it's having the courage to talk. And academic courage is an oxymoron, unfortunately. And we need to find a way to make sure that the generation after us is not afraid to fuse its moral values with its scholarly work and be citizens of the society and not being the examiners of the society. And I think that is something that is not just, should not just laid at the front of Trump and the populist leaders. The liberal, the more moderate, so supposedly more democratic liberal political elites that were before Trump were doing the same, but just in a different way. So we are facing a moment of truth, and that is important. First and foremost, of course, for our ability to defend the people of Gaza from further destruction and genocide. But I think it's also important for a wider range of issues that are connected to the essence of politics and the real nature of academic work and the role of academics and intellectuals in the society.
Could I
Yeah,
come in?
Jonathan, go on.
Yes, just a relevant point, I think, is that the academics, we're talking a lot about universities here, but the academics trade union is UCU. And every year since, I think, about 2006 or 2007, it's passed by overwhelming majorities resolutions in favor of Palestine and indeed in favor of boycott of Israeli institutions. We have in the United States the equivalent of UCU, and I can't remember precisely what it's called, as the Association of University Professors, I think it's called, which has long had a policy of opposing all boycotts, has now changed that, and it's no longer part of its if you like, of its standing position. So that people are shifting under the evidence of what Israel is doing with support of the leaders of our countries. And I think things might become possible at the workplace, certainly at the university workplace, maybe elsewhere, that were not possible before because of people's horror of the abomination that's going on. And we should not be slow in seeing where we can make more progress than we used to think was possible.
Fantastic. Tony, did you want to come in on this as well?
Yeah, it's bound up with this, really. It was my own experience. I was, at the end of last year, I was invited by the Palestine Solidarity Committee at Delft University in the Netherlands to speak on campus. And then the students wrote to me to say that they refused to let them a room because my values did not associate with those of the university. This was a university that only a couple of weeks before had welcomed onto campus Admiral Ellis, who's been involved in all sorts of war crimes in Afghanistan and Iraq, and was on the board, I think he was the chief executive of Lockheed Martin, the biggest weapons producer in the world. Yet his values did coincide with Delft University and mine didn't. As it happens, I spoke anyway because we simply spoke outside the library, and the meeting was probably much bigger because of that. But it gives you an example of how even in what used to be liberal Netherlands, the values of really corporate fascism in many ways are taking hold. And freedom of speech for anyone who doesn't agree with this militarization of the universities, and it's a technical university, are banned now. And Delft had a wonderful record in the when the Nazis occupied it, and the Jewish professors were removed. There was a mass rebellion amongst the students, I have to say, just like Timothy van der Hagen today, the then rector tried to prevent the occupation and demonstrations, but he was outnumbered and had to give way. And the leader of the students at that time was incarcerated, arrested by the Gestapo shortly after, and died in a concentration camp. But there is and has been a battle for freedom of speech on campuses, just as in society as a whole, and it needs to be renewed. None of our freedoms are there forever, but they are hard fought and easily lost.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to tie it back now to the main purpose of the webinar, which is to build an alliance of resistance and a sort of learning base to strategize moving forward. So there's a question here from Ivan Zeta. Are there any plans of building a network of international international legal team to help defense teams on IHRA cases around the world? Is anybody aware of that?
Could you say it again? I didn't catch.
Sorry. Yeah. So are there any plans of building a network or international legal team to help defense teams on IHRA cases around the world?
Well, for Europe, there's the ELSC, the European Legal Support Centre, which does a wonderful job in defending people who are threatened in their livelihoods or otherwise by accusations of anti-Semitism. Most of its cases are either in Germany or in the UK, because that's where most of these cases occur. But they win virtually all of their cases. So I don't think they go outside Europe, but there's a similar group in the United States. I can't remember what it's called now, but
yeah, there is. I don't remember the name, but there is one in the States, in North America altogether. Yeah, there is one. Yeah, we can find out and send it.
Yeah, European Legal Support Service.
Centre.
Sorry, yeah, European Legal Support Centre, very helpful network. They're overstretched at the moment. I've been in contact with them as well about a case of doxing against me. Somebody leaked my personal data to the Jewish Chronicle, who then wrote a defamatory article about me. So they have been very helpful, and others have as well. Right. Okay, let's see if there's another question we can take. Tony, do you have any reference of a question here? Because we're going to wrap up in about 8 minutes or so.
No.
Okay. Let me take one from Les Levin. The fundamental problem is the racist stereotype underlying the IHRA's Israel example, even if they are not explicitly cited. How to attack those stereotypes? That's a tough one, I can imagine.
Again, could you just repeat it?
Yeah, the fundamental problem is the racist stereotype underlying the IHRA's Israel examples, even if they are not explicitly cited. How to attack those stereotypes? Les, perhaps if you're there, do you want to come in and just elaborate a little bit on there? Can I give you the ability to speak?
Yeah, you can do.
I'll do that now.
Allowed to talk.
Yeah.
There you are. Okay.
Who is going to speak? Sorry.
Levitov.
I don't think you mean me. I'm Leah Levain, so it's a different L.
I've done it the wrong person, have I? Oh. I thought it was Les Levador. I did.
I have spotlighted him, but maybe it's not working.
If you go to his,
okay, yeah,
okay,
yeah, okay, yes. By racist stereotype, I think the speakers pretty much know what I mean, namely stereotyping Jews as allied with or supportive of the Zionist project.
Oh, right. Yeah. Okay.
Right. And there are strong institutional motives for perpetuating that stereotype, regardless of the increasing evidence to the contrary. You know, for the obvious reason is that all the Western ruling elites need the stereotype to justify their policies, and that driver will continue forever until somehow we undermine it, regardless of whether there's a definition that codifies it. So how to undermine that stereotype in practice, not just in a definition.
Okay,
I'm not really sure, but for one example, the Board of Deputies of British Jews is the archetypal establishment body that supports Israel. And recently, a sizable bunch, I think 36 of the deputies, signed a statement which we wouldn't think went far enough, but was distancing itself from Israel. You should not underestimate the extent to which there is dissent among the Jewish population, but many of them will not come out with that for fear of seeming to be bucking the tribal loyalty test. But I think there is disturbance there. I'm not quite sure how you can't fight the words in a definition. All you can do is encourage people to dissociate themselves from it.
But I think it's happening anyway. I mean, the younger American Jewish generation dissociates itself from Zionism. Even those who define themselves as secular Jews are finding ways that are not associated with Zionism to define their Judaism. This is a growing trend. And I don't think there is a substitute for explaining that defining Judaism as nationalism or defining the Jews as a race is actually an anti-Semitic trope that anti-Semites use in order to say the Jews are not Germans and Jews are not French. They are a race to themselves or a nation to themselves. And I understand what Lev is asking, but I really think this is disintegrating by itself. It sort of implodes from within. One of the major reasons there is this inability in Israel today among the Jewish society to work together, even in what they claim is their moment of existential danger, is that secular Jews and religious Jews do not agree anymore, or never really agreed, but now more than ever before, don't agree what does it mean to be Jewish, let alone what does it mean to be a Jewish state. This is tearing the Israeli Jewish society apart. I think that the IHRA definition ignores the fact that one of the major failures of Zionism is not just the fact that it imposed itself on the Arab world and became a settler colonial project that is motivated by the logic of elimination against the Palestinians, that it was not a feasible project because it thought that the best way of dealing with anti-Semitism is to define Judaism as nationalism. And that is not working. It is not working in Israel, and it's not working for a lot of young Jews around the world. So I think that the problem is it's a long process that would have a very positive impact, I think, on the reality on the ground. But the urgency is what's happening now, and we somehow don't have the luxury just to wait for long-term processes of change. But I think that this particular issue, this whole idea of Zionism that originally was evangelical Christian anyway, that the Jews are a separate race or a separate nation, is going to just evaporate by itself. But it will take time. And until it happens, in the name of this ideology, of course, not only the crimes against the Palestinians are perpetrated, but also the support for the crimes is given in the name of the same ideology. Yeah, but I do think that we have to both strategize in the long term, and decolonize and unpack these fabrications and manipulations, and find more practical and immediate terms to stop the genocide. I think we are all aware that Israel in the next 2 or 3 days is going to enter again with all its military might. Not that there's much to destroy in Gaza anymore, but starvation is now the official Israeli policy. It's now officially declared by Israel as a policy, and one wonders how far will the world go with these explicit kind of policies of genocide that are now broadcast openly. So I think that we should find whatever we can to do even more, and I'm sure we're all doing all we can, because they don't seem to be deterred by anything that has happened so far. But I'm sure that we'll eventually be able to first of all tame them, and then hopefully even to change the more dramatically reality on the ground. Yeah.
Can I just put this into context?
Sure.
Israel is not supported because Donald Trump loves Jews. Israel is supported because the United States sees it in its material interests. Israel is the West's attack dog in the Middle East. I mean, when the Balfour Declaration was issued in 1917, it was against the vehement opposition of the border deputies. And in fact, the only person in the Lloyd George War cabinet who voted against it was its only Jewish member, Sir Edwin Montagu. Fast forward to today, the reason the US, Britain, Germany, and so on support Israel as they do and turn their eyes from the famine and all the rest of the atrocities in Gaza has really nothing to do with Jews, but Jews are the moral alibi. Just as when Britain went into India in 1830, I mean, it was before then, but it was because of their concern about the custom, the Hindu custom of sati, that you burning a widow on her husband's funeral pyre. Of course, that wasn't the reason, but that was the moral justification. So Jews today are the moral justification for everything that happens that Israel does, because in a sense, Israel is not a Jewish state except racially. It's certainly not religiously. It's complete nonsense. And most Israelis have contempt for the diaspora, just as Zionism began with a contempt for the diaspora and wanted to create the new Jew. So we have to understand that even if every Jew converted to anti-Zionism, they would still be supporting the Jewish state. I mean, anti-Zionist Jews are invisible today for the ruling class because we don't conform to their narrative. So there is a limit to what we can do as Jews anyway. I'm not saying we don't do anything. I'm as active as anyone. But the political context of that is that we provide the excuse, just as they did in Algeria for the French, the Crimea decree, just as you get the Asians did in East Africa. It's an old imperialist trick in a sense, and it's playing out today. Thank you.
I'd just like to say that there are significant splits opening up in Israeli society as well. Although there is this overwhelming support, there are still people who really dissent most strongly. There's the one that came out in Haaretz, the leading Israeli newspaper, in the last couple of days. And I think it was a letter written by Professor Daniel Blattman, who's head of the Institute of Contemporary Jewry at the Hebrew University. And what he said was, I've studied the Holocaust for 40 years. I read countless testimonies about the horrific genocide of all against the Jewish people and other victims. However, the reality in which I would read accounts about mass murder committed by the Jewish state in Gaza that in chilling resemblance remind me of testimony from the Yad Vashem archives that I could not have foreseen. That's an example of an informed dissent, powerfully expressed. And I think for everyone who says that, there are others who will be thinking it, but are perhaps not yet emboldened to say so. But Ilan would know more about that than I do.
Yeah, but I think we have exhausted the time.
We are over time, actually,
Yeah.
yes. So unless, without wanting to put Lubna on the spot, if you have any sort of final remarks, Lubna, because I'm conscious that you have not had that much of a chance in the Q&A. So please do give us your personal wisdom.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, we've been working very hard behind the scenes, and like I said, we've formulated a lot of literature and model motions, so strategies. It's about taking both the grassroots action, so this is where the activism comes in, applying the political activist pressure, and also from the inside. So there are those, I mean, I know there are councillors who are very, like we said, bound by the Labour whip, and so there's only so far they'll go. But that coupled with our pressures, with union action, it's important that we mobilise workers into action. and whether it's through the unions or rank and file action. We're happy to share the literature and the model motions that we have drafted. We've done one on state repression, one on divestment, and another one on the IHRA, and are willing to pursue a challenge through legal means as well as what we're doing now. So we're very happy to collaborate with anyone who would like to support or who we can help with this and share the same information that we're using. I think it's important that we share that widely across the team. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Lubna. And thank you to all of those who have come and listened to this webinar here. We will make the recording available afterwards. Thank you for sharing your Friday night with us. Thank you so much to all of our speakers, Tony, Lubna, Ilan, David Johnson, Jonathan, and I think that's probably it.
Thank you
very
Kristina.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing.
Yes, thank you.
Bye. Have a nice
Bye.
weekend, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.